The heavy oak door groaned open under Thomas Whitmore's trembling hand, revealing a foyer that reeked of something putrid masked by cloying jasmine perfume. He stepped across the threshold of Blackwood Estate, his boots echoing against marble floors that gleamed despite the layer of dust coating everything else. The cryptic letter crumpled in his coat pocket had summoned him here with promises of inheritance, but nothing had prepared him for the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press against his chest like a physical weight. Portraits lined the burgundy walls in ornate golden frames, dozens of them stretching up toward the vaulted ceiling. Each depicted a different woman, yet they all shared the same unsettling quality, a smile that didn't reach their eyes, as if they knew something terrible that Thomas did not. The subjects ranged from auburn-haired beauties with porcelain skin to exotic dark-eyed sirens, but that same haunting expression marked every face. Their painted gazes seemed to follow him as he moved deeper into the mansion, and he found himself quickening his pace to escape their collective stare. "Master Thomas, I presume?" The voice made Thomas jump, his heart hammering against his ribs. An elderly man emerged from the shadows beside the grand staircase, his movements unnaturally silent despite his apparent age. The butler, for that's what he had to be, given his formal black attire, possessed the most unsettling smile Thomas had ever witnessed. His teeth were the color of old ivory, yellowed and worn, yet perfectly straight. His pale blue eyes held an intelligence that seemed far too sharp for his weathered face. "I am Edmund Graves, your late uncle's steward. Master Silas spoke of you often, though I confess he never mentioned you might visit so soon after his departure from this world." Edmund's voice carried the refined accent of the upper classes, but underneath lay something that made Thomas's skin crawl, a quality he couldn't quite identify but that reminded him of oil sliding across water. "I received word that I've inherited this estate," Thomas said, his voice sounding smaller than he'd intended in the vast space. "Though I must admit, I know precious little about my uncle's affairs." "We weren't close." Edmund's smile widened, revealing more of those yellowed teeth. "Oh, Master Silas understood family relationships can be complicated. But blood calls to blood, doesn't it? He was quite specific in his will that you should inherit not just the estate, but the family business as well." "Business?" Thomas frowned, glancing around the opulent foyer with its crystal chandeliers and silk-draped furniture. "What sort of business?" Instead of answering directly, Edmund gestured toward a corridor that branched off to the left. "Perhaps it would be better to show you, Master Thomas. Your uncle was quite proud of what he built here." "Quite proud indeed." They walked through room after room, each more lavishly decorated than the last. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and every surface seemed to gleam with gold leaf or precious metals. Velvet curtains in deep crimsons and purples blocked much of the natural light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. The air grew thicker as they progressed, heavy with that same cloying perfume and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made Thomas breathe through his mouth. "Your uncle catered to a very exclusive clientele," Edmund explained as they passed through a drawing room furnished with divans and low tables set with crystal decanters. "Gentlemen of means who sought experiences unavailable elsewhere in London. Men of particular tastes and unlimited funds." Thomas paused beside a mantelpiece dominated by an enormous painting of a raven-haired woman in a state of partial undress. Her eyes held that same haunting quality as all the others, but something about her expression suggested a deeper sadness. "Are you telling me my uncle ran some sort of establishment?" "The most exclusive brothel in all of Victorian England," Edmund said with obvious pride. "The Blackwood Estate served lords, members of Parliament, even minor royalty. Your uncle possessed an extraordinary talent for acquiring the most beautiful women and providing experiences that his clients could find nowhere else." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. His legs felt suddenly unsteady, and he reached out to grip the mantelpiece for support. A brothel. His inheritance was a brothel. The portraits on the walls, the opulent furnishings, the suffocating atmosphere, it all made horrible sense now. "I can't," Thomas whispered, shaking his head. "I won't be part of this. I'll sell the estate and—" "Oh, but Master Thomas," Edmund interrupted, his voice taking on a gentle, almost paternal tone. "You haven't seen the true marvel of your uncle's work. The innovation that made Blackwood Estate legendary among those who could afford its services." Edmund moved to a section of the wall that looked identical to every other paneled surface, but when he pressed against it, a hidden door swung inward with a soft click. Behind it lay a narrow staircase descending into darkness, and from below rose an odor that made Thomas gag, something chemical and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. "The basement houses your uncle's greatest achievement," Edmund said, producing a brass key from his waistcoat pocket. "The special clients, Master Thomas. The ones who pay the most handsomely for experiences that transcend the ordinary boundaries of pleasure." Thomas stared into that yawning darkness, every instinct screaming at him to turn and run. But Edmund was already descending the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the space below, and something, curiosity, morbid fascination, or perhaps the weight of family obligation, compelled Thomas to follow. "The gentlemen who frequent this particular service," Edmund's voice drifted up from below, "have very specific requirements. They seek beauty that time cannot touch, companionship that death cannot part, and pleasures that exist beyond the veil of mortality itself." Thomas's hand trembled as he gripped the banister, each step taking him deeper into whatever horror his uncle had created. The chemical smell grew stronger with every breath, mixed now with incense and something else, something that reminded him of the morgue he'd visited when identifying his father's body years ago. "Master Silas discovered something remarkable during his travels in Egypt," Edmund continued, his voice now coming from somewhere in the depths below. "Ancient techniques, lost arts that the pharaohs used to preserve their most precious treasures. But your uncle improved upon their methods. He perfected them." Thomas reached the bottom of the staircase and found himself in a corridor lit by flickering gas lamps. The walls were lined with doors, each bearing a small brass nameplate, and from behind several came the soft sound of muffled voices, though whether they belonged to the living or the dead, Thomas could no longer be certain. Edmund stood at the far end of the corridor, that terrible smile wider than ever. In his hand, he held an ornate brass key that caught the lamplight like a tiny flame. "Welcome to the true heart of the family business, Master Thomas," Edmund said, inserting the key into the lock of the final door. "Your special clients are waiting. Would you have followed that butler into the basement, knowing your family's darkest secret was waiting below?" The door opened onto a sight that would haunt Thomas for whatever remained of his natural life. The basement had been transformed into an elaborate maze of chambers, each decorated to resemble exotic locations from around the world. Rich tapestries depicting Middle Eastern markets hung beside bamboo screens that suggested Far Eastern temples. Moroccan lanterns cast dancing shadows across silk cushions and ornate divans, while Egyptian hieroglyphs covered walls adorned with golden artifacts. But it was not the opulent decor that made Thomas's stomach lurch and his vision blur at the edges. It was the occupants of these carefully crafted fantasy rooms. In glass cases throughout the basement, positioned like precious artwork in a collector's gallery, were the preserved remains of dozens of women. Each had been wrapped in silk of different colors, some in pristine white, others in deep purples and blues, a few in gold that caught the lamplight and seemed to shimmer with its own internal glow. Their faces, visible through carefully arranged gaps in the wrappings, retained an otherworldly beauty, as if death had touched them with gentle fingers and left them in peaceful slumber. "Magnificent, aren't they?" Edmund's voice carried the tone of a curator discussing priceless paintings. "Your uncle spent years perfecting the process. Traditional Egyptian mummification, enhanced with certain innovations he discovered in his research." Thomas stumbled backward, his hand flying to cover his mouth as bile rose in his throat. "These are human beings. These are women who volunteered for immortality," Edmund corrected, moving to stand beside the nearest case. Inside lay a blonde woman whose silk wrappings revealed classical features that belonged on a Roman statue. Meet Constance. She came to us suffering from consumption, her beauty fading daily as the disease consumed her lungs. Your uncle offered her a choice: die slowly and ugly, or live forever in perfect preservation. The butler's aged hand stroked the glass lovingly, and Thomas noticed that the woman's eyes, visible through the wrappings, seemed to track the movement. A strangled sound escaped his throat. They're still aware. The process your uncle developed preserves not just the physical form, but consciousness itself, Edmund explained with obvious pride. They see, they hear, they understand. They simply exist in a state between life and death, eternal, beautiful, and available to those willing to pay for such extraordinary companionship. Thomas forced himself to look around the basement with fresh horror. There had to be at least 50 cases, maybe more, arranged throughout the various themed chambers. In the Egyptian room, women wrapped in linen and gold lay beneath painted sarcophagi. The Oriental section housed figures draped in silk the color of jade and cherry blossoms. Each preservation was a work of art, and each represented a life transformed into something unspeakably wrong. The clientele, Edmund continued, leading Thomas deeper into the maze of rooms, consists of London's most influential men. Lords who have lost beloved wives, politicians seeking discretion, merchants with exotic tastes. They come here for experiences impossible to find elsewhere, companionship with perfection that cannot age, cannot leave, cannot disappoint. They paused before a case containing a dark-haired woman wrapped in crimson silk. A small brass plaque read, Isabella, acquired 1823. The woman's eyes, still bright and aware, seemed to focus on Thomas with an expression of desperate pleading. How long does the consciousness last? Thomas whispered, unable to look away from those tormented eyes. Forever, as far as we can determine, Edmund said cheerfully. Constance has been with us for 3 years now, and she's as alert as the day she arrived. Some of our earlier acquisitions have been conscious for over a decade. Thomas finally tore his gaze away from Isabella to stare at Edmund in horror. This is torture. This is an abomination. You've created a basement full of women trapped in their own dead bodies, conscious but unable to speak, unable to move, unable to die. Edmund's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his pale blue eyes, something that might have been amusement. Master Thomas, you speak as if this is a prison. But consider the alternative these women faced. Constance would have died ugly and forgotten. Isabella was destined for the workhouses, her beauty wasted on men who could never afford to appreciate it properly. Here, they serve a higher purpose. They bring joy to those who can afford true beauty. Joy. Thomas's voice cracked. You call this joy? The client seemed to think so, Edmund replied, producing a leather-bound ledger from inside his jacket. Your uncle kept meticulous records. Lord Ashworth visits Constance every Tuesday and Thursday. The Marquis of Blackwood has a standing appointment with Celeste in the French salon. Sir Reginald Hawthorne prefers the Oriental section, specifically the girl we call Lotus Blossom. Thomas snatched the ledger from Edmund's hands, his eyes scanning pages of appointments and payments. The sums were staggering, amounts that could support a family for years, all paid for weekly visits with the mummified remains of once living women. This ends now, Thomas said, his voice gaining strength as rage began to overcome his horror. I'm closing this place. I'm burning it down if I have to. Edmund's smile never wavered, but he reached out and gently took the ledger back. Master Thomas, I admire your moral stance, truly I do. But you haven't considered the practical implications. This establishment employs not just myself, but 5 living women who depend on its success for their survival. They prepare the new acquisitions, maintain the preserved ladies, and serve as consultants for our more particular clients. Living women. Thomas felt a new wave of nausea. There are living women working here. Of course. The process requires living assistance, both for the initial preservation and for the ongoing maintenance. Would you like to meet them? I believe they're taking their afternoon treatments right now. Before Thomas could respond, Edmund was leading him to another staircase, this one ascending to the floors above. As they climbed, Thomas noticed that his hands were shaking uncontrollably and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. The full scope of what he'd inherited was beginning to sink in, not just a building full of the preserved dead, but a functioning business that depended on continued horror for its survival. The ledger's figures danced in his memory. Even if he wanted to shut everything down immediately, there were contracts, obligations, employees whose livelihoods depended on this nightmare continuing. And somewhere above, 5 living women were taking treatments, whatever that meant in this house of horrors. Thomas paused on the stairs, gripping the banister as the weight of his situation crashed down on him. He was now the proprietor of the most exclusive brothel in London, an establishment that trafficked in the preserved dead and employed the living to maintain them. He was responsible for dozens of conscious women trapped in their own corpses, and for whatever was being done to the 5 women upstairs. Edmund waited patiently at the top of the stairs, that same terrible smile playing across his yellowed teeth. The family business, Master Thomas. Your uncle built something truly unique here. Something that transcends the ordinary boundaries between life and death, between pleasure and preservation. Thomas forced himself to continue climbing, each step taking him deeper into a legacy he never wanted but could no longer escape. The upper floors of Blackwood Estate revealed themselves as living quarters that rivaled any nobleman's residence, but with an atmosphere thick with secrets and unspoken dread. Edmund led Thomas through corridors lined with more of those unsettling portraits, past rooms furnished with canopied beds and velvet chairs, toward the sound of quiet voices drifting from behind an ornately carved door. The ladies prefer to take their afternoon treatments together, Edmund explained, his hand hovering over the door handle. It builds solidarity, you understand. Shared purpose. Before Thomas could ask what treatments could possibly be necessary for living women in this house of preserved dead, Edmund knocked softly and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a study in contradictions, beautiful and terrible, luxurious and clinical. 5 women sat in a circle of high-backed chairs, each with a crystal glass in hand containing liquid that shifted color from amber to deep green as they lifted it to their lips. The first thing Thomas noticed was their beauty. Each woman could have graced the most fashionable salons in London, with perfect features and an otherworldly quality that made them seem almost too lovely to be real. The second thing he noticed was their skin, all possessed a waxy, translucent quality that reminded him uncomfortably of candle wax or fine porcelain. Ladies, Edmund announced with a theatrical flourish, may I present Master Thomas Whitmore, your new proprietor. The tallest of the group rose from her chair with movements that seemed to flow like water. Her auburn hair cascaded over shoulders draped in silk the color of deep wine, and her green eyes held an intelligence that was immediately apparent. When she spoke, her voice carried the cultured tones of aristocracy, though underneath lay something that made Thomas think of distant thunder. I am Evangeline, she said, offering a curtsy that belonged to royal courts. We have been eagerly awaiting your arrival, Master Thomas. Your uncle spoke of you with great affection. The others rose to join her, each introduction revealing names that seemed chosen for their beauty rather than given at birth. Rosalind possessed raven-black hair and pale skin that seemed to glow from within. Cordelia's blonde locks framed features that belonged on Renaissance paintings. Beatrice moved with a dancer's grace, her dark eyes holding depths that suggested hidden sorrows. Ophelia, the youngest-looking of the group, had silver hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, though she appeared no older than 20. Please, sit with us, Evangeline gestured to an empty chair that had clearly been placed in anticipation of his visit. We have much to discuss about your inheritance. Thomas remained standing, his eyes moving from face to face, noting details that became more disturbing the longer he looked. Their skin wasn't just waxy, it was gradually becoming translucent, showing the delicate tracery of veins beneath. Their movements, while graceful, possessed a deliberate quality that suggested each gesture required conscious thought rather than natural reflex. "What are you?" he whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. Rosalind laughed, a sound like silver bells mixed with winter wind. "We are your uncle's greatest triumph, Master Thomas. We are women who chose immortality over decay, beauty over death. The treatments you're taking," Thomas said, gesturing toward the glasses they still held, "what are they?" Ophelia lifted her glass toward the light, watching the liquid swirl and change color. "Your uncle's refinement of the ancient preservation process. We take small amounts daily, allowing our bodies to gradually transform while maintaining consciousness and mobility. We are becoming like our sisters below, but slowly, beautifully." Thomas felt his knees weaken. "You're mummifying yourselves." "Willingly. We are transcending the limitations of mortal flesh," Cordelia corrected, her voice holding the fervor of a religious convert. "Uncle Silas showed us that death need not mean the end of beauty, the end of purpose. We serve as guides for new acquisitions, as caregivers for our preserved sisters, and as living examples of what awaits those brave enough to choose eternity." Evangeline moved closer, and Thomas caught the scent that clung to her, not quite perfume, not quite the chemical smell from the basement, but something that combined flowers with antiseptic. "Your uncle was a visionary, Master Thomas. He understood that some experiences transcend the ordinary boundaries between life and death. Our clients don't simply seek physical pleasure, they seek communion with beauty that time cannot touch." "How long have you been?" Thomas struggled to find words that didn't sound completely insane, taking the treatments. "I began my transformation 3 years ago," Evangeline said with obvious pride. "The process is gradual, allowing us to maintain our functions while slowly achieving preservation. Rosalind and Cordelia have been with us for 2 years, Beatrice for 18 months, and dear Ophelia just began her journey 6 months ago." Thomas stared at Ophelia, trying to reconcile her youthful appearance with the idea that she was voluntarily destroying her own body. "Why? Why would anyone choose this?" Ophelia's silver hair caught the light as she tilted her head, considering his question. "I was dying, Master Thomas. A growth in my brain that would have taken my beauty, my mind, my dignity. Uncle Silas offered me a choice, waste away in agony, or transform into something eternal and lovely. Which would you have chosen?" Before Thomas could answer, Beatrice spoke up, her dancer's posture perfect even while seated. "I was destined for the streets. My family lost everything, and I had only my looks to sell. Here, I serve a higher purpose. I am cherished, protected, and slowly becoming immortal." Cordelia nodded in agreement. "We were all facing ugly deaths or ugly lives, Master Thomas. Your uncle gave us beauty, purpose, and eternity. We are grateful beyond measure." Thomas looked around the circle of faces, seeing the absolute conviction in their eyes, the religious fervor that made his stomach churn with fresh horror. They weren't prisoners, they were willing participants in their own gradual destruction, and they saw it as salvation. "The clients," he said, his voice barely audible, "they come to see you as well as the preserved ones." Rosalind's smile revealed teeth that were slightly more translucent than they should have been. "Some prefer to experience the transformation process firsthand. They find excitement in companionship that exists between life and death. We are unique in all the world, Master Thomas, living mummies who can still speak, still move, still provide experiences impossible to find elsewhere." Edmund, who had been standing quietly by the door throughout this conversation, cleared his throat. "Master Thomas, perhaps you would like to see the preparation chambers. The ladies are expecting a new sister to join them next week, and the initial preservation requires careful planning. Thomas felt the room spinning around him. New sister. Lord Pemberton's daughter, Evangeline said matter-of-factly. Consumption has left her quite ill, and she has requested the transformation rather than face a lingering death. She's a lovely girl, fair-haired, with the most beautiful blue eyes. She'll make a wonderful addition to our family. The casual tone with which she discussed acquiring another victim, another willing victim, made Thomas stumble backward toward the door. These women spoke of murder and self-destruction as if discussing tea and weather. They had been transformed not just physically but mentally, their perspectives warped by whatever process was slowly killing them. "I need air," Thomas gasped, pushing past Edmund and fleeing toward the stairs. Behind him, he heard Evangeline's voice, still perfectly composed, "Don't worry about Master Thomas, dear Edmund. The adjustment period is always difficult for new proprietors. Uncle Silas reacted the same way initially. He'll come to understand the beauty of what we've created here." Thomas reached the main floor and rushed toward the front door, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the estate. But as his hand touched the door handle, he realized with dawning horror that escape might no longer be possible. He was the legal owner of this nightmare, responsible for its continuation or destruction. And somewhere in London, a girl named Pemberton was counting the days until her voluntary preservation began. Thomas spent the night in a coaching inn 3 miles from Blackwood Estate, but sleep brought no relief from the horrors he'd witnessed. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Isabella's desperate gaze or heard Evangeline's cultured voice describing immortality through gradual death. By morning, his resolve had crystallized into a single purpose: he would shut down the establishment, sell the property, and somehow find a way to help the 5 living women end their transformations before it was too late. But when he returned to the estate, a black carriage bearing an aristocratic coat of arms stood waiting in the circular drive. Edmund met him at the door with that same unsettling smile, though his pale blue eyes held a warning that made Thomas pause on the threshold. "Lord Ashworth is here for his regular appointment," Edmund said quietly. "Tuesday and Thursday, 10 o'clock sharp. He's been visiting Constance for over 2 years and becomes quite distressed if his schedule is disrupted." Thomas followed Edmund through the familiar corridors, his stomach knotting with fresh revulsion as they approached the basement stairs. The chemical smell seemed stronger today, mixed with expensive cologne and something else, something that reminded him of grief made tangible. In the basement, Lord Ashworth knelt beside Constance's glass case, his head bowed as if in prayer. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair and the refined bearing of old money, but his shoulders shook with barely contained emotion. In his hands, he held a bouquet of white roses that he'd arranged carefully on top of the case. "My darling girl," Lord Ashworth whispered, his voice cracking with pain, "I've brought you your favorites. The same roses from our garden at Ashworth Manor, remember? You always said they smelled like heaven itself." Thomas watched in horrified fascination as the Lord continued his one-sided conversation, telling Constance about the weather, the social events she was missing, the way her sister's children were growing. He spoke to the preserved woman as if she could respond, pausing occasionally as if waiting for answers that would never come. After nearly an hour of this intimate communication, Lord Ashworth rose and approached Edmund with the dignity of a man conducting important business. From his waistcoat, he withdrew a leather purse heavy with gold coins. "The usual arrangement, Edmund. 2 hours of privacy, and please ensure the room temperature remains constant. Constance grows uncomfortable when it's too cold." Edmund accepted the payment with a respectful bow. "Of course, my lord. Everything will be exactly as you prefer." As Edmund began unlocking Constance's case, Thomas found his voice. "Wait. What exactly is happening here?" Lord Ashworth turned to regard Thomas with eyes that held the hollow look of a man who had lost everything that mattered. "You must be Silas's nephew." "I am Lord Ashworth of Ashworth Manor, and I am here to spend time with my beloved Constance." "Your beloved?" Thomas repeated, struggling to understand. "My fiancée," Lord Ashworth said with simple dignity. "We were to be married in the spring of 1824, but consumption took her before we could exchange vows. Your uncle offered her preservation rather than burial, and I agreed. She is as beautiful now as the day I first saw her, and through his remarkable process, she remains aware of my presence." Thomas stared at the man, seeing genuine love and grief warring with something that looked disturbingly like madness. "But she's dead. She exists between life and death," Lord Ashworth corrected, his voice taking on the fervor Thomas had heard in Evangeline's words. "She sees me, she knows me, and in her presence I can speak of things I could never share with the living. Our love transcends the ordinary boundaries of mortality." Edmund finished unlocking the case and carefully lifted Constance's silk-wrapped form, carrying her with surprising gentleness to a nearby divan surrounded by fresh flowers and burning candles. The preserved woman's eyes tracked the movement, and when Lord Ashworth sat beside her, something in her expression seemed to shift, not quite recognition, but an awareness that made Thomas's skin crawl. "I come here twice weekly," Lord Ashworth continued, settling beside Constance and taking her wrapped hand in his. "We discuss poetry, politics, our future plans. She cannot speak, of course, but I see the intelligence in her eyes, the love that death could not diminish." Thomas watched the obscene tableau with growing revulsion, but before he could voice his objections, Lord Ashworth turned to him with sudden intensity. "I have a proposition for you, young Whitmore. My son Charles reaches his majority next month, his 21st birthday. I wish to commission a preservation for him as a coming-of-age gift." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "You want to acquire another woman?" Charles has been visiting Blackwood Estate for several months, observing the process and the results. He's quite taken with the concept, and I believe a companion of his own would teach him about true love, love that transcends mortality, beauty that time cannot touch. Edmund stepped forward, his expression eager. "Lord Ashworth is prepared to pay handsomely for the service. Enough to sustain the estate's operations for several years. The amount is negotiable, naturally," Lord Ashworth said, "but I'm thinking in terms of £5,000 for the right candidate. Charles has expressed interest in brunettes, perhaps someone with artistic sensibilities. A musician or dancer would be ideal." Thomas felt bile rising in his throat. "You're talking about murder. You want me to find a young woman and kill her for your son's amusement?" Lord Ashworth's expression hardened. "I'm talking about offering immortality to someone who faces an uncertain future. Your uncle never forced anyone into preservation, he offered it as an alternative to less pleasant fates. The women who chose this path did so willingly, with full understanding of what they would become." £5,000, Master Thomas," Edmund added quietly. "Think of what that could accomplish. The estate could operate comfortably for years, the ladies upstairs could continue their treatments, and you could make improvements to the facilities." Thomas stared at the two men, seeing the calm acceptance in their faces, the way they discussed human trafficking as if negotiating the purchase of furniture. Around them, the preserved women in their glass cases seemed to watch with eyes that held depths of horror Thomas couldn't fully comprehend. "No," he said finally, his voice gaining strength. "Absolutely not. I won't be party to this madness." Lord Ashworth's face fell, the grief in his eyes deepening. "Perhaps you need time to consider the proposal. Charles's birthday is still 3 weeks away, and I'm willing to increase the offer if necessary." "The answer will never be yes," Thomas said firmly. But as Lord Ashworth returned to his intimate conversation with Constance, and Edmund began calculating figures in his ledger, Thomas realized with growing horror that his refusal might not be enough. The estate operated on a system of contracts and expectations that extended far beyond his understanding. Somewhere in London, young women faced uncertain futures, and men like Lord Ashworth offered them immortality through preservation. The business his uncle had created wasn't just about maintaining the women already trapped in glass cases, it was about acquiring new ones. And Thomas was now legally, morally, and financially responsible for every aspect of this nightmare. As Lord Ashworth whispered endearments to his preserved fiancée and Edmund counted gold coins with practiced efficiency, Thomas understood that shutting down Blackwood Estate might be far more complicated than simply walking away. The clients had expectations, contracts had been signed, and 5 living women upstairs depended on the establishment's continued operation for their very survival. He was trapped as surely as the women in their glass cases, bound by legal obligations and moral responsibilities he couldn't escape. If this was your inheritance, would you have found a way to honor those contracts, knowing what they truly meant? That night, Thomas barricaded himself in what had once been his uncle's study, determined to find legal documents that might free him from his horrific inheritance. The room reflected Silas Whitmore's eclectic interests, shelves lined with medical texts, archaeological journals, and volumes on ancient Egyptian burial practices. A massive desk dominated the center, its surface covered with correspondence, financial records, and sketches that made Thomas's stomach turn. The drawings depicted various stages of the preservation process in clinical detail, showing how living tissue could be gradually transformed while maintaining consciousness. Silas's handwriting filled the margins with notes about chemical compositions, treatment schedules, and observations about the psychological effects of gradual mummification. It read like the journal of a brilliant madman. But it was a leather-bound volume hidden in a secret drawer that revealed the true horror of Thomas's situation. The book, titled The Whitmore Legacy, in Silas's careful script, detailed the family's involvement in the preservation business spanning 3 generations. What Thomas had assumed was his uncle's personal obsession was revealed to be a hereditary calling that had claimed every male heir for nearly a century. According to the journal, Thomas's grandfather, Marcus Whitmore, had discovered the preservation techniques during an archaeological expedition to Egypt in 1760. Hidden within a sealed chamber beneath the Great Pyramid, Marcus had found papyrus scrolls detailing a process used by corrupt priests to create eternal servants for wealthy nobles. But the Egyptian method had been improved upon, refined through decades of experimentation that turned willing volunteers into conscious prisoners of their own preserved flesh. The journal described Marcus's first attempts at preservation, conducted in the basement of the family's London townhouse. Early subjects had died quickly, their consciousness fading within days of the initial treatment. But Marcus persevered, adjusting chemical compositions and ritual procedures until he achieved his first successful preservation, a young woman named Catherine who remained aware and beautiful for over 2 years before finally succumbing to madness. Silas's entries detailed how he had inherited not just the family business, but the burden of maintaining it. The preservation process required constant refinement, new techniques, fresh subjects. But more disturbing were the psychological changes Silas described in himself as he became more deeply involved in the work. The process calls to something in our bloodline, one entry read. I find myself drawn to the basement at all hours, speaking with the preserved ones as if they were old friends. Their eternal beauty, their perfect helplessness, feeds something in my soul that I didn't know existed. Is this how Marcus felt? Is this the price of our gift? Thomas read with growing horror as Silas described his gradual transformation from reluctant inheritor to devoted practitioner. The man who had created Blackwood Estate hadn't started as a monster, he had been corrupted by the work itself, by prolonged exposure to the preserved dead and the power that came with controlling their eternal existence. But the most terrifying revelation came in the journal's final entries, written just weeks before Silas's death. The preservation chemicals, Silas had discovered, didn't just affect the women who took them voluntarily. Prolonged exposure in the atmosphere of the basement, combined with handling the treated subjects, had begun to affect Silas himself. His skin had taken on a waxy quality, his movements had become deliberate and careful, and his thoughts had grown increasingly disconnected from normal human concerns. I suspect the process is claiming me as it claimed Marcus, the final entry read. But unlike the women who choose preservation, we male heirs experience the transformation differently. We retain our mobility and speech longer, but lose our connection to life itself. We become living guardians of the dead, bound to the estate and its inhabitants by chemical and spiritual ties we cannot break. Thomas dropped the journal with shaking hands. If Silas's theory was correct, simply being in Blackwood Estate was beginning the same transformation that had consumed his uncle and grandfather. The stiffness he'd noticed in his joints, the way colors seemed less vivid since arriving, the strange dreams filled with whispered voices, were these the early signs of his own gradual preservation? A soft knock at the study door interrupted his spiraling panic. Edmund entered without waiting for permission, carrying a silver tray with tea and small cakes that looked far too elaborate for a simple evening refreshment. "Master Thomas, you've missed dinner again. The ladies are concerned about your health." Thomas stared at the food, remembering how Evangeline and her companions had spoken of treatments that came in liquid form. "Is this what you've been feeding me? The same chemicals that are transforming those women?" Edmund's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his pale blue eyes, a satisfaction that made Thomas's blood chill. "Your uncle's journal, I presume. He was always too fond of documenting everything. Such a scholarly mind. How long have you known?" Thomas whispered. "How long have you been poisoning me?" "Poisoning is such an ugly word," Edmund said, settling into a chair across from the desk. "I prefer to think of it as an introduction. The estate requires a Whitmore heir to function properly, and the heir requires certain modifications to fulfill his role effectively." Thomas pushed back from the desk, his chair scraping against the floor. "You've been drugging me since I arrived. Small amounts in your food, your tea, even the air you breathed down in the basement," Edmund confirmed with clinical detachment. "The process works best when introduced gradually. Your uncle fought it initially, just as you're doing now, but eventually he came to understand the beauty of what he was becoming." The butler rose and moved to a bookshelf, retrieving an ornate wooden box that Thomas hadn't noticed before. When Edmund opened it, the chemical smell that permeated the basement wafted out, along with something else, something that made Thomas think of ancient tombs and forgotten rituals. "Would you like to see your grandfather, Master Thomas? And your uncle? They're quite eager to meet you." Before Thomas could respond, Edmund was leading him to yet another hidden door, this one concealed behind a tapestry depicting scenes from Egyptian mythology. The passage beyond was narrow and descended steeply, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on walls covered in hieroglyphs that looked disturbingly authentic. They emerged into a circular chamber that felt older than the rest of the estate, its stone walls suggesting construction that predated the Victorian mansion above. At the center of the room, on raised daïses surrounded by burning incense and offerings of gold and precious stones, sat two figures that made Thomas's mind reel with incomprehension. The mummified remains of two men, wrapped in linen and silk, occupied throne-like chairs carved from black stone. Their faces, visible through carefully arranged bandages, retained enough human features for Thomas to recognize the family resemblance. These were his grandfather and uncle, preserved with the same techniques used on the women but transformed into something even more disturbing. Unlike the women in the basement, whose preservation maintained their beauty and femininity, the male mummies had been transformed into something regal and terrible. Gold leaf covered portions of their wrappings, and their faces had been treated with substances that gave their skin a metallic sheen. Most horrifying of all, their eyes remained open and aware, tracking Thomas's movement with an intelligence that death should have extinguished. "Marcus Whitmore," Edmund said, gesturing to the figure on the left, who discovered the ancient secrets and brought them to London. "And Silas Whitmore, who perfected the process and built this magnificent establishment. Both chose preservation when their time came, preferring eternal consciousness to the uncertainty of death." Thomas stared at his grandfather's mummified face, seeing recognition in those ancient eyes, along with something that might have been approval or anticipation. When Marcus tried to speak, only a dry whisper emerged, but Thomas could make out individual words: welcome, home, family, legacy. Silas's voice was stronger, though still barely audible. Thomas, my boy, you've grown into such a fine young man. The estate needs you, as it needed me, as it needed him. The sight of his uncle speaking from beyond death broke something fundamental in Thomas's mind. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring as the full scope of his situation became clear. The estate wasn't just a business, it was a generational trap that claimed every male heir, transforming them into conscious guardians of an increasingly elaborate necropolis. The transformation is already well underway, Edmund continued conversationally. Your skin has that lovely translucent quality that indicates successful chemical absorption. Your movements are becoming more deliberate, more considered. Soon you'll find that normal food tastes wrong, that sunlight hurts your eyes, that you prefer the company of the preserved to the living. Thomas felt his legs give way, and he collapsed to his knees on the cold stone floor. How long do I have? Your uncle lasted 6 months before choosing preservation, Edmund said. Your grandfather held out for nearly a year, but the process was less refined then. You might manage 3 or 4 months if you fight it, but why struggle against something so beautiful? Marcus's whispered voice drifted across the chamber: fighting only brings pain. Accept the gift, join the family. Silas nodded with movements that should have been impossible for someone so thoroughly preserved. The women need guidance, the clients need service, the legacy must continue. Thomas looked up at Edmund, seeing him clearly for the first time. The butler's skin possessed the same waxy quality as the women upstairs, but his preservation was more advanced. How long had Edmund been taking the treatments? How many generations of Whitmore men had he served and watched transform into conscious mummies? You're like them, Thomas whispered. You're preserved too. I've been maintaining this estate for over a century, Edmund confirmed. I served your great-grandfather before Marcus, and I'll serve your son after you, should you choose to have one. The process grants extended life to those who serve the family faithfully. The butler moved to stand beside Marcus's throne, his hand resting possessively on the preserved man's shoulder. The establishment requires continuity, Master Thomas. The clients depend on it, the women need guidance, and the ancient powers that make preservation possible demand tribute in the form of willing participants. Thomas tried to stand but found his legs unsteady, his movements already becoming the deliberate, careful motions he'd noticed in the women upstairs. The realization that his transformation was irreversible hit him with crushing finality. Whether he fought or accepted, the chemicals in his system would eventually claim him completely. What am I supposed to do? He asked, his voice breaking with despair. Marcus and Silas exchanged a look that somehow conveyed decades of shared experience and resignation. When Silas spoke again, his whispered words carried the weight of prophecy. What we all do, my boy. We serve the estate, we maintain the preservation, and we wait for the next generation to join us. It's not such a terrible fate: consciousness without pain, awareness without worry, purpose without end. Edmund smiled his terrible yellow smile. Welcome to the true Whitmore legacy, Master Thomas. Your real education begins now. As Thomas knelt on the cold stone floor, surrounded by the mummified remains of his ancestors and the ancient butler who had served them all, he understood that his inheritance wasn't just a business or a building, it was a curse that had claimed every male in his family line, transforming them into eternal guardians of the most horrific enterprise ever conceived. The estate had claimed him the moment he'd walked through its doors, and like his grandfather and uncle before him, he would eventually take his place on a throne in this underground chamber, conscious and aware for eternity, watching new generations of Whitmore men discover their terrible birthright. 3 weeks passed in a haze of gradual transformation that Thomas watched with growing detachment. His skin had taken on the translucent quality of fine porcelain, and his movements required conscious effort that reminded him of a marionette operated by an increasingly unsteady hand. Food had lost all flavor except for the bitter chemical treatments Edmund provided twice daily, which brought temporary relief from the stiffness that seemed to creep through his bones like winter frost. The most disturbing change was psychological. Thomas found himself drawn to the basement preservation chambers at all hours, speaking with the mummified women as if they were old friends. Isabella's desperate eyes had begun to seem merely melancholy rather than terrified. Constance's weekly visits from Lord Ashworth appeared touching rather than obscene. The entire enterprise was starting to make a horrible kind of sense. It was on a foggy Tuesday morning that everything came to a head. Thomas was in the Egyptian chamber, discussing poetry with a preserved woman named Cleopatra. Her real name had been Mary, but clients preferred the exotic appellations, when Edmund appeared with news that shattered his growing acceptance. "Master Thomas, we have a visitor. The young lady Lord Ashworth commissioned for his son's birthday has arrived for her consultation." Thomas felt something that might once have been horror stir in his chemically altered consciousness. In his gradual transformation, he had nearly forgotten about Lord Ashworth's request for a fresh preservation. "I told him no. I refused the commission." "Ah, but you see, the young lady came of her own accord," Edmund replied with obvious satisfaction. "Miss Charlotte Pemberton, daughter of Lord Pemberton. Consumption has advanced to her lungs, and she's heard whispers about our services through certain social circles. She's requesting preservation rather than facing a lingering death." Thomas followed Edmund upstairs with movements that felt increasingly mechanical. In the main parlor, a young woman sat perched on the edge of a velvet settee, her hands folded in her lap with the careful composure of someone fighting to maintain dignity in desperate circumstances. She couldn't have been more than 19, with fair hair and blue eyes that held the fevered brightness of advanced tuberculosis. Charlotte Pemberton was beautiful in the fragile way of consumptives, her cheeks flushed with the false bloom of disease and her slender frame suggesting a bird that might take flight at any moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the cultured tones of aristocracy mixed with the breathlessness of failing lungs. "Master Whitmore, I've come to inquire about your preservation services. I understand that you offer an alternative to conventional death." Thomas stared at the girl, seeing not a potential victim but a fellow sufferer facing impossible choices. His transformed perspective made her request seem reasonable rather than horrific. She was dying anyway, wasn't eternal consciousness preferable to the grave? "Miss Pemberton," he heard himself saying, "the process is quite involved. Perhaps you should discuss this with your family." "My family believes I should die gracefully and quietly, accepting God's will," Charlotte interrupted, her blue eyes flashing with desperate determination. "But I've heard that you can offer something more. That consciousness need not end with the body's failure." Evangeline glided into the room at that moment, her own transformation now advanced enough that her skin seemed to glow with internal light. She moved to Charlotte's side with the grace of a dancer, though her steps made no sound on the marble floor. "Dear child," Evangeline said, her voice holding the warmth of a loving sister, "you've come to exactly the right place. We understand what you're facing, the fear, the pain, the terrible awareness that everything you are will simply stop." Charlotte's composure cracked slightly, tears gathering in her fevered eyes. "They say I have perhaps 2 months. 2 months of increasing agony as my lungs fail and my body wastes away. But I've heard whispers that you offer immortality, consciousness preserved beyond death." Thomas watched the scene unfold with the detached fascination of someone observing a play. The chemicals in his system had altered his emotional responses, making him see the interaction as a beautiful tableau rather than a tragedy in motion. "The process," Evangeline continued, settling beside Charlotte with fluid grace, "allows gradual transformation rather than sudden death. You remain aware, beautiful, and free from pain. Your consciousness exists in a state between life and death, eternal, peaceful, perfect. Charlotte's breathing became more labored as excitement mixed with her disease's limitations. And I would still be aware of the world around me. Forever, Evangeline confirmed. You would join our sisterhood of women who chose transcendence over decay. Your beauty would never fade, your mind would never diminish, and you would bring joy to those privileged enough to appreciate your eternal nature. As Thomas listened to this exchange, he realized that the horror he'd felt upon first discovering the estate had been completely overwhelmed by his gradual transformation. Charlotte's request no longer seemed like murder, it seemed like mercy. She was offering herself voluntarily, choosing preservation over the ugly death that tuberculosis would inevitably bring. Edmund appeared at his elbow with a contract written in elegant script on expensive paper. The Standard Preservation Agreement, Master Thomas. Miss Pemberton's signature, witnessed by yourself and the ladies, will formalize the arrangement. Thomas stared at the document, seeing the careful legal language that transformed murder into a business transaction. The contract specified payment terms, preservation methods, and the client's understanding that the process was irreversible. Charlotte would sign away her life in exchange for eternal consciousness, and Thomas would become complicit in her transformation. But as he watched Charlotte's face light up with hope for the first time since entering the parlor, Thomas found that his transformed consciousness couldn't see anything wrong with the arrangement. The girl was dying anyway. This way, her death would have meaning, purpose, beauty. The process takes approximately 1 week, Evangeline explained as Charlotte reached for the offered pen. Gradual introduction of the preservation chemicals, careful monitoring of the transformation, and finally the silk wrapping that will maintain your beauty for eternity. Charlotte signed the contract with a steady hand, her signature marking her transition from dying girl to willing sacrifice. As ink dried on the paper, sealing her fate, she turned to Thomas with eyes that held gratitude rather than fear. Thank you, Master Whitmore. You've given me something my doctors never could, the promise that death won't be the end. Thomas accepted the signed contract from Edmund, noting how natural the action felt despite its ultimate meaning. His transformed state allowed him to see Charlotte's choice as noble rather than tragic, her preservation as transcendence rather than horror. But somewhere in the depths of his chemically altered mind, a small voice screamed in protest. This was wrong. This was murder dressed up as mercy, and he was about to become directly responsible for transforming a living girl into a conscious corpse for the pleasure of wealthy perverts. The voice grew fainter as Edmund handed him a crystal glass filled with the amber liquid that brought such blessed relief from the stiffness in his joints. As Thomas drank, watching Charlotte discuss her upcoming transformation with Evangeline and the other women, he felt the last of his human revulsion fade away. He was becoming what his uncle and grandfather had become, a willing guardian of the estate's horrific purpose, transformed beyond recognition into something that could facilitate horror while seeing it as beauty. Charlotte would join the other preserved women within the week, and Thomas would oversee her transformation with the same calm detachment that Edmund had shown when discussing business arrangements. The cycle would continue, generation after generation, until someone with enough strength to resist the chemical corruption could break the pattern. But as Thomas looked around the parlor at the faces of the women he now considered family, he realized that such strength might be more than any Whitmore heir could muster. Would you have signed that contract to save a dying girl, even knowing what she would become? Charlotte Pemberton's transformation proceeded exactly as Evangeline had promised. Over the course of 7 days, Thomas watched the girl's vibrant life force gradually dim while her beauty crystallized into something beyond mortal perfection. The preservation chemicals worked their ancient magic, stopping the ravages of consumption while slowly mummifying her living tissue. By the final day, Charlotte moved with the same deliberate grace as the other women, her blue eyes holding depths of awareness that transcended ordinary human consciousness. On the 8th day, as Charlotte lay wrapped in silk the color of winter sky, Thomas felt a peace he'd never known settle over his transformed mind. The girl who had arrived desperate and dying was now eternal, beautiful, and free from pain. When Lord Ashworth's son Charles arrived for his birthday appointment, Thomas watched with genuine satisfaction as the young man's face lit up with wonder at his new companion. But it was during the wrapping ceremony that Thomas fully understood his metamorphosis was complete. Standing in the basement chamber surrounded by dozens of preserved women, watching Charlotte take her place among them with serene acceptance, he felt no horror, only a profound sense of rightness. This was what the estate existed for. This was what the Whitmore family had been called to oversee. Edmund approached with his eternal yellow smile, carrying a crystal decanter filled with liquid that shifted from amber to deep gold in the lamplight. "Your treatments have progressed beautifully, Master Thomas. I believe it's time for the final preparation." Thomas accepted the glass without hesitation, drinking deeply of the solution that would complete his transformation. The taste was no longer bitter, it reminded him of honey mixed with precious metals, sweet and warm as it settled in his stomach. Around him, the mummified women watched with eyes that reflected his own journey toward transcendence. "The throne chamber awaits," Edmund continued, gesturing toward the hidden staircase that led to the circular room where Marcus and Silas maintained their eternal vigil. "Your ancestors are eager to welcome you to the family's true purpose." The descent felt like a homecoming. Thomas's movements had become so deliberate that each step required conscious thought, but the effort no longer seemed burdensome. It was a dance, a ritual, a transformation from base humanity into something far more refined. In the throne chamber, Marcus and Silas turned their preserved faces toward him with expressions of profound satisfaction. When they spoke, their whispered voices blended into a chorus that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "Welcome, my boy," Silas breathed, his words carrying across decades of shared understanding. "You've embraced the gift, accepted the responsibility, joined the eternal family." Marcus nodded with movements that spoke of centuries of patience. "The estate is yours now, as it was mine, as it was his. Guard it well, serve it faithfully." Thomas felt his legs give way, but instead of falling, he found himself settling onto a third throne that had appeared in the chamber, black stone carved with hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and move in the flickering torchlight. The seat fit his transformed body perfectly, supporting him as his muscles began the final stages of preservation. "The chemical process is nearly complete," Edmund explained, beginning to wind silk bandages around Thomas's hands with practiced efficiency. "Your consciousness will remain intact, but your body will achieve perfect preservation. You'll oversee the estate's operations for as long as it serves the ancient powers that make this possible." As the silk wound around his arms and torso, Thomas felt a profound contentment settle over his mind. The bandages didn't restrict him, they completed him, transforming him from merely human into something eternal and purposeful. When Edmund began wrapping his face, leaving only his eyes exposed, Thomas understood that he was becoming exactly what the estate needed. Days passed, or perhaps weeks, time had become meaningless to Thomas's preserved consciousness. He watched from his throne as Edmund continued the estate's operations with seamless efficiency. New clients arrived to visit their eternal companions. The living women upstairs continued their gradual transformations, each growing more beautiful as they approached preservation. Fresh acquisitions were negotiated, processed, and added to the basement chambers. And through it all, Thomas presided with the calm wisdom of someone who had transcended ordinary human concerns. When difficult decisions arose, which new clients to accept, how to handle particularly demanding requests, whether certain candidates were suitable for preservation, Thomas found that his transformed state provided perfect clarity. The estate's needs always came first. The ancient powers that enabled preservation demanded absolute dedication. On what might have been a Tuesday morning, though seasonal changes were irrelevant in the underground chambers, Edmund approached with news that would have once filled Thomas with horror. "Master Thomas, we have a most prestigious request. The Prince Regent himself wishes to commission a preservation for his private collection. He's offering £10,000 for the right candidate. Thomas considered this information with the detached calculation that had replaced human emotion. £10,000 would allow significant improvements to the estate, better accommodations for the preserved women, enhanced preservation techniques that could extend consciousness even further. What type of candidate does His Royal Highness prefer? Thomas asked, his voice emerging as a whisper from behind silk wrappings. Young, aristocratic, musically gifted. He specifically requested someone who can appreciate the finer arts during their conscious preservation. Thomas nodded slowly, the movement requiring considerable effort but feeling entirely natural. Place advertisements in the appropriate social circles. Word it carefully, we're seeking a young lady facing terminal illness who might be interested in alternative arrangements. As Edmund bowed and departed to fulfill these instructions, Thomas felt the profound satisfaction that came with serving the estate's purpose. Somewhere in London, a dying aristocrat would soon discover an opportunity for immortality. The cycle would continue, as it had for generations, as it would for centuries to come. Marcus and Silas watched their descendant with obvious approval, their preserved faces reflecting the pride of ancestors whose legacy had been properly maintained. When they spoke, their whispered voices carried the weight of eternal wisdom. "Well done, my boy," Silas breathed. "You understand now, what we built, what we serve, what we protect." Marcus's ancient voice added its agreement, "The estate endures, the preservation continues, the family serves." Thomas gazed around the circular chamber with eyes that no longer needed to blink, seeing the hieroglyphs on the walls shift and dance in patterns that revealed ancient truths. The Egyptian priests who had first developed these techniques had understood something fundamental about consciousness and preservation that modern medicine couldn't grasp. Death was not an ending, it was a transformation, an elevation to a higher state of existence. The estate existed to facilitate that transformation for those brave enough to choose it. The Whitmore family had been called to serve as guardians of this sacred knowledge, preserving beauty and consciousness for generations of clients who sought experiences beyond ordinary mortality. And Thomas had joined that eternal service, his own transformation complete, his consciousness preserved forever in service to the estate's sublime purpose. Above him, he could hear the sounds of daily operations, clients arriving for their appointments, the women upstairs discussing their ongoing transformations, Edmund managing the business with century-refined expertise. Each sound represented another thread in the tapestry of preservation that the estate wove through London's social fabric. The appointments would never end. The preservation would continue. The estate would endure. And Thomas Whitmore, last of his line but first of a new generation of eternal guardians, would oversee it all from his throne in the chamber beneath, conscious and aware for whatever remained of time itself. If you stayed with this story to the end, comment, the appointments never end.